Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Michael Scott from the UK, speaking to you from a very sunny day in Oxford here in the UK. And welcome also from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC. To this, the 10th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Las Casas Institute for Social Justice, Blackfriars Hall, the University of Oxford, and Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions across a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished panel and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the Q&A session. Our topic today is rights in conflict, free speech and religion. We had no idea, Sandy and myself, how significant that title would be, as we think now today of those poor people in Afghanistan who are looking for rights in conflict, free speech and religion. So it is a topical, and for many of us a very sad day that in which we're talking to you. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the button at the bottom of your screen. These will come to me during the session, and I will try to put them in a coherent order to the panel to consider. We urge you, please, to ask questions from the moment the session starts, and I will try and put as many as possible to the panel. So I hope you have an enjoyable first discussion. I'll sign off now, leaving it to Sandy, and I'll be back in a little while to put the questions to the panel. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome to everybody who's joined us from near and far today. We have a very important discussion. As Mike says, it has perhaps become more important than when we first thought of this idea a few months ago. Our topic is rights in conflict, free speech, and religion. And I will introduce just briefly the panelists that you've already heard about from the various invitations in alphabetical order. With us from Salt Lake City, Utah, therefore up very early in the morning to do so, is Kelsey Dallas, who is a religion and politics correspondent for the Deseret News in Utah and has been recognized widely for her handling of legal, religious, political issues. Edward Hadas, a research scholar at Blackfriars Hall at Oxford. And Edward, we're grateful to you for taking the place of someone who had to withdraw just a few days before the program, and pleased to have you join us. William Kay is the founding director of the Center for Pentecostal and Charismatic Studies at Bangor University in North Wales in the UK, and has done a great deal of looking at the issues of the evolving role of religion. Louise Melling is the Deputy National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union and head of its Center for Liberty in New York, and has argued before the Supreme Court in some of the landmark cases of recent years on this topic. And so we're very lucky that the storm bypassed her somewhat, where she is in Connecticut right now, and she is still able to join us today. We will have a discussion, as Mike said, among the panelists for about 3/4 of an hour, and then follow the questions. Please, for the audience, do not try to use the chat link. It won't work. It shouldn't work for you, I think, and just use the Q&A button to submit your questions. So we're going to get started right away, and our panelists know that they're not here to deliver speeches or long presentations. We're going to have a concise and lively conversation. We may interrupt each other from time to time. We're not being rude, just eager to contribute to the discussion. If the panelists will remember to unmute themselves, that will of course be very helpful right from the start. I would like to begin by saying that many of us had come to believe that this was an era of secularism, that religion, while respected and observed by an enormous number of people around the world, that religions were stepping back somewhat from an effort at social control and organization, and that secularism would emerge and rights would be practiced more cooperatively with each other. William, I wonder if you might comment on that, and then the particular areas of religious practice that you have studied. And I might just point out that you are in fact a minister in the Pentecostal Church in the United Kingdom.
Right. Well, thank you, Sandy, for that opening question. I think the rise of secularism is an extremely difficult, multi-causal, multifactorial matter. I mean, it's a very tangled and lengthy historical evolution, and it is difficult to pinpoint one particular instance of why it is that secularism has arisen, or why it is that religion may have surged again. But I will offer you one kind of thought on this, is that religion does address the perennial existential questions of the human race: death, bereavement, loss, pain, love, hope. These matters have been part of the human story from its beginning. And religion is one way in which human beings have sought to address these issues. Of course, human beings with different concepts of what is of ultimate worth and value, but for those who are believers, ultimate worth and value rests in God. Ultimate worth and value rests in a transcendent being. And so I guess to the extent that human life hasn't changed, people still love, die, hope, and so on. Religion continues to offer answers to those fundamental questions of the human condition.
Thank you for starting us off quite eloquently, William. Louise, I'd like to turn to you and ask you to take the premise that William has asserted and comment on, from your legal perspective, obviously, how this has played out in terms of equality issues, speech, self-expression issues, especially in recent times. Obviously, your experience is primarily in the United States, but some of what you have to say, I think, is obviously applicable on an international scale.
Sure. So thank you for having me join you today. And I first have to say, Sandy, thank you so much for elevating me to having been a Supreme Court oralist. I have in fact been part of the teams, but never the person who argued. So just have to clarify that, especially to give credit to those who did argue our cases before the Supreme Court. I think I don't know that I think of this question as much as a secular and religious question, in the sense these debates about what values govern society and what the role is for religion as we construct those rules have always been present. What we're seeing right now in the United States, I think, as I think about the topic of this panel, is an increased claims by institutions, and I want to focus on institutions, businesses, schools, hospitals, asserting a right under the Constitution or under other US federal law not to comply with an anti-discrimination law. This isn't new. This was true in the context of civil rights. This was true in the context of emerging issues around women's rights, but it's very intense right now in the United States, and that's for political reasons and cultural reasons, I think. But I think what makes this topic relevant here today in particular is what the debate that we're seeing right now reflects about sort of, I often call it like shifts in the tectonic plates, shifts in what the rules are that are governing society and how we actually cope with that. So we didn't see these kinds of claims when we hadn't sort of been at these moments where all of a sudden we recognize civil rights for people of color and in particular for Black people, or right now as we're recognizing LGBT rights, or when we're recognizing the rights of women or reproductive rights. So there's a debate and a contest between people of certain faiths, like the faith, we can't treat faith as if it's monolithic. We certainly know that's not the case. Faith lands on all sides of these debates. It's just that some, for me as a lawyer, it winds up, some faiths wind up playing the debates in court in different ways, but there's a debate about whether or not to recognize certain key rights. We saw this in the case, for example, before the United States Supreme Court about whether to recognize same-sex marriage. There were some faith briefs that were filed that said, court, don't do this, because if you do this, you're going to create all these conflicts for religious liberty. You're going to see cases forever if you do this. They even saying it will be worse than the debates you see about abortion. And you also saw groups of faith filing in support. And then once the court does, in fact, legislatures do, in fact, recognize the right, then there are all sorts of claims. I shouldn't have to comply with this because my faith says it's wrong. And how do we resolve those debates in society is really a question that happens in the legislatures. It happens, at dinner tables, and it's playing out in the courts extensively right now.
Edward, you have looked at some of these issues with a historical perspective, and I think from some of what I've seen that you've said before, the arguments may not be so new, even though they strike us as new.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me, as Louise said. Yeah, I'm trying to get my head around what Louise just said, because it strikes me as such an odd way of looking at the situation. We create rights on a sort of regular basis in the 20th century. And that's something that we're very good at. And then obviously, the more rights you create, the more conflicts you're going to have between rights. And freedom of religion, insofar as we think about the history of rights, the right to practice your religion is one of the first rights that was created. And it was created as a political, obviously it has a sort of philosophical thing behind it, but it's basically a political compromise, as we said, as tectonic plates of society shift, and you shift from a vision where we don't separate out religion from government in any very clear way. If you look at most cultures and most of history, you don't even have a category of religion as different from what the governance does. It's a sort of part, it's entwined with how we run the society. And then in the 17th century, John Locke writes about tolerance as a sort of concession to the problems of having more than one religion in a society and not having a clear consensus on what should be the dominant relationship. So it's a long story, and we're in a very interesting chapter. But the idea that there's going to be a kind of eternal conflict, I think, is right, that secular and religious powers are always going to be in somewhat, authorities are going to be in conflict. We just we now live in an era where secular authority is in fact not just not religious, but actually quite anti-religious or distant from religion. And so it sets a different kind of conflict than we had before, where you might have had conflicts between religions. I'll close in a second just by saying that in John Locke's essay on tolerance, he does say that atheists shouldn't be allowed to give testimony in court, because by definition, their oaths are unreliable. We've come a long way from that.
Kelsey, please remember to unmute yourself. I really want to ask you about this from two perspectives, and I'll start with the broader one of the role of the media, not just in the United States, but around the world, and especially in Western democracies, the role of the media in trying to get their heads around these issues and handle them in a thoughtful way, which may be thoughtful media may be beginning to be an oxymoron, but without going entirely into turning this into just one more political issue?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I do believe that there are many really smart religion reporters out there, people who are watching the intersection of religion and the law. But what has struck me recently is how just a simple decision about a headline or a decision about how to begin a story can really change the tone of the debate, sometimes in really scary ways, negative ways. And I think about that with what we're describing in terms of many faith groups feeling threatened by the powers of secularism, or threatened by Democrats in Congress or a Democratic administration, and feeling like they're being attacked. And sometimes the administration or the media can unintentionally increase those feelings of threat by using the language of battle in the stories or in the headlines. And I was thinking about that quite a bit last week as I wrote about the landscape right now with religious colleges and sort of what is their future, how do they grapple with growing support for LGBTQ rights and sort of rethink, potentially change their policies around gender, sexuality, and same-sex marriage. And I had that word threat in the headline, and for many people it really sort of undermined the project of the story, trying to be thoughtful and think through it, because they said, oh, Kelsey's just another one of those reporters that's trying to capitalize on controversy instead of sort of really being thoughtful. So it's just the media feels like we have pitfalls all over the place. And it's, even if you're trying to be very careful about word selection in the story, the headline can end up sort of putting a bad taste in people's mouth.
Let me stay with you for a second, Kelsey, because you work in Utah. And Utah might be cited along with some other areas in the country where religion, in the case of Utah, a specific minority religion, Mormonism, Church of Latter-day Saints, has a very strong influence over politics and over public affairs, human affairs, and events. And I wonder if you see this as an exception that is not important, or if it is something we're all going to have to contend with one way or another eventually.
Oh, I believe it is an exception, and I don't think that we'll see it replicated in other states, in the sense that I don't think suddenly you would have legislatures all over being totally dominated by members of one faith group. You may have majority Christian, but they would belong to different denominations, and so they wouldn't act as one in the way that perhaps people believe Latter-day Saint lawmakers do here. What I think is fascinating in Utah is that although there are probably examples where people say, oh, it's wild to live here as a non-Latter-day Saint, or can you believe the laws they have about alcohol, for example, and what strength percentage is allowed to be sold in restaurants. There are other ways where members of the church in the political sphere has been very proactive and sort of thoughtful about its interaction with issues like gay rights, and said, we obviously have the numbers to just clamp down and say we're not going to pass anything on gay rights, but instead they said, how can we try to use our position and come up with a law that we work with members of the LGBT community on. And so it's fascinating in a number of ways that they have this control, the members of the church and church leaders, but in some senses, they're trying to be wise about how they use it to build a more welcoming state and to recognize the diversity of opinions. And Utah is becoming more diverse because we have a large tech industry that's just growing. And so we have huge numbers of people moving in here, often from California, which is much more liberal than the state of Utah, what is currently and certainly was in the past. And so Utah is going to be changing.
Thank you, William. That's a very interesting description of how this all works out in Utah, do you see that as a model, a fervency of faith and yet tolerance and compromise with secular instincts?
In a way, I do. I guess one of the things I wanted to say, because we are on free speech, is that I do profoundly believe in the importance of free speech. And I do believe that free speech, in some senses, is that freedom which protects all other freedoms. So that if you don't have free speech, other freedoms fall by the wayside. So I believe that free speech is an absolutely essential element of civic society. And I hope, I'll give you one other example, if I may, which is to do with the biology in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, where Soviet biology under Lysenko was made to conform to Marxist-Leninist doctrine. And the consequence was that Soviet biology was held back. They rejected Mendelian genetics. And the consequence further then was that the crop harvests in the Soviet Union were poor and that many people starved. So had they allowed freedom of speech within the scientific realm, their science would have been better and their people would have been well fed. So as far as I'm concerned, freedom of speech is absolutely fundamental to other freedoms, and freedom of speech is absolutely fundamental to the scientific endeavor. And so with regards to religion, I mean, I think religion needs to listen to those voices which are contrary to it. But at the same time, those voices that are contrary to it need to listen to religion. I know this may sound a kind of very liberal, idealistic view, but I do think that we are together in the human condition. I do think that we are of one species. We are of one, we are one. I could give a blood donation to any other human being on the earth. I could give a kidney donation. We are one in that sense, people upon the earth. As a religious person, I can believe that everybody came from Adam and Eve, if I want to. As a religious person, I can believe in the unity of the human race. And therefore, I believe that it is important that we listen to each other and that we talk to each other. And what you've described, Kelsey, about what goes on in Utah, where people are willing not to enforce the powers they politically have because of their numerical superiority, I think that could be something that should and could be observed. And in some senses has been observed. You think of the golden age in Spain, the time of Maimonides, and you think of a time when there was Jews and Muslims and Christians coexisted. So it is possible for this to happen. And I hope that it will happen in the future.
I just wanted to add that, and Louise might speak to this, but there are certainly those who could say that my description of Utah is viewing what's happening through rose-colored glasses because of the prominence of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In a sense, they get to control the scope of the debate, or sort of what types of solutions are proposed. And so it might be valuable to look to other states where there's no majority of secularists or no majority of a particular faith group, and see what they're up to, because then maybe everyone comes to the table with equal power.
I was just going to ask Kelsey one question about what she's experiencing, which is, I've heard, but I'm not here to say that it's true. I know that the Mormon Church, I think that Latter-day Saints took, was amply criticized after there were disclosures that they had made many donations to support California's ban on same-sex marriage proposition. I forget which proposition number it was. And what sort of, I don't know the history of the evolution, but what's interesting is that that came to light. There were sharp critiques, and it seems just from the outside as if the church took that quite seriously and has it hasn't changed its position on a lot of issues, but has certainly reached out in other ways and has your anti-discrimination law. I think ultimately the church signed on to. I believe that the church took an active role in some of the fights over Religious Freedom Restoration Act when there was concern that those were going to be used in ways that would wind up being discriminatory in some fashion. And I'll also say that, I mean, I was invited to speak at the law school recently about abortion and LGBT rights, which I think probably doesn't comport fully with everybody's stereotype and just supports the proposition that you're talking about, William, which is the importance of free speech and, you know, opening up a space for people to talk and hear. And I don't think that's the stereotype of the church, but I think that the church is more open, at least to letting people speak and listening than some people think.
Yeah, my impression is that the church is being proactive about saying we need to be part of these conversations, even if we're uncomfortable or anxious about where those discussions could lead. And I am really excited to hear about that type of invitation, Louise, because one of the things that I feel is a broader trend is that as religious groups get more nervous about the force of secularism or liberalism, that they're kind of battening down the hatches and saying, no thanks, if you're in a different camp, we're not going to host this conversation, or we're not interested in having an enemy come behind our lines or something. And so I do think that what can help us move forward to a more positive place, either as a country or as a world, is just to continue listening to each other, to listening to things that challenge us.
William, are your glasses rose-colored on these issues at the moment?
Possibly. I mean, I do think it's important to keep before us a vision of what we hope will happen in the best future. I think if we become a society that's divided into numerous subgroups, each struggling against the other, each asserting its rights against the other, each hurting and hating the other, I think we are entering a realm of social fragmentation, and we are, I think, I mean, in some senses, Europe went through this with its wars of religion. Britain went through a civil war. So I think, you know, Edward mentioned John Locke and toleration, and that comes from, you know, it's after the British Civil War that Locke, who is a Protestant, pleads for toleration. And actually, only in December 2020, the University of Cambridge decided to adopt that word toleration. At first, there was an attempt to say we should respect other views, but the whole university rejected that by a large majority, over 3/4, and said, no, we're willing to tolerate views, which means that we will listen to, we will hear, but we will respectfully disagree with those views that we don't hold. And I think that is a mixture between rose-tinted and unrealistic.
Well, I think especially once you go into the policy arena, it's pretty, I realize these are provocative words and it's oversimplified, but there are sort of winners and losers in some sense in terms of the struggles. So I think once you raise certain issues, there will be conflict.
I'm going to go for your view, Louise. And this is, there are winners and losers, and the conventional or traditional or up to 19th century, 20th century vision of what religion involves and what it is, its role in society is losing. I mean, that's what I'm hearing here. And, you know, I obviously I will say I'm not happy about it, but I think it's realistic to say that there is a secular vision that involves a lot of rights, that the right to freedom of religion becomes very constrained if in the way that's done. And I may regret that, but I think it's fair to sort of say, yeah, that's what's happening. There are winners and there are losers, and religion as a social force, religion as a setter of moral standards is losing. in Western countries. In fact, it's really pretty much lost in terms of influence from what one used to think of, at least, that is to say, religious, this set of moral or social teachings is now very much a kind of minority view that is tolerated, which was certainly not what John Locke had in mind.
Right. Well, this word tolerance actually, on one hand, seems very durable. It goes back a long time, but there are many current fighters for equality who don't think that tolerance is enough. I found myself in discussion, in arguments with a colleague at the college I used to run a few years ago, who said, we don't just want to be tolerated. That's not good enough, because you can be tolerated and still lose, to take up the maybe sports language, not military language, but you can still not get what you need to fulfill yourself. And Louise, maybe you might resort to a couple particular cases. I think the Masterpiece Cake Shop dispute is an especially interesting one to try to view in this frame. What, the decision was ambiguous, I think some people felt. And how do you analyze that case from this perspective?
I'll just, for purposes of the audience, lay out the basic facts. So a couple, Dave and Charlie, went to a bakery where they were living, and what they intended to do was ask the bakery to make a cake for their wedding reception. They went in with Charlie's mother, they sat down, and the owner of the bakery asked them who the cake was for, and they said it was for them, and he told them that he wouldn't make the cake, and they left the shop. We represented Dave and Charlie in this case, so obviously the story I have to tell most poignantly is the story of Dave and Charlie, and I was deeply moved by Dave's mother, Debbie Munn. Debbie Munn talks about what happened when they got in the car, and she talks about sitting in the back seat and seeing her son's shoulders just quivering, and he said, "They told me I'm not good enough." Charlie had moved to Colorado from Wyoming, where he grew up, really kind of hoping that it would be a more tolerant place for him as a gay man, and had been, I think, in high school, or was sort of old enough to know at the time when Matthew Shepard was killed in Wyoming. So had some sort of traumas around what happens in areas where there's extreme action. The case goes to the United States Supreme Court ultimately, with the bakery arguing that that they had a right protected by the Constitution, both for speech and religion, to refuse to provide service to Dave and Charlie, and which I will say, like as I say to the press, that was arguing a constitutional right to discriminate, a constitutional right to exempt yourself and your business, which operates in the commercial sphere under commercial rules, from complying with an anti-discrimination law. The Supreme Court issued a curious opinion. I think it was really the Supreme Court's issuing some narrow opinions, and I have several questions about how it's developing. The Supreme Court issued a narrow opinion saying, in this case, we think the decision makers didn't approach this with neutrality. And therefore, we're going to say that this wasn't a fair decision against Masterpiece Cake Shop made by there was discrimination against the cake shop in how it was decided. They didn't address at all the question about whether you do or could claim a right to be exempt from an anti-discrimination law. As I watch the court, I think the court's debating a whole series of things. And I think, is the court going to treat this question like it treats abortion, which is every single time we're going to look at the facts and we're going to kind of chip away, but we're never going to do something that looks really bold that you're going to recognize. We'll just chip away. And at least in the court is using language of discrimination. So is the court going to see discrimination, not in the sense of who the law is aiming to protect, on whose behalf it was enacted, but rather on behalf of those who object to complying. And so does it go almost the way of affirmative action in terms of how it starts to understand the issue in American jurisprudence? Similar issues, there are cases in the UK that have come up, like a similar bakery, similar cases, both in a host of contexts. These cases are arising.
Is either William or Edward prepared to explain the similarities or the differences in those cases in the UK?
I'm not. No.
I'm not a lawyer. No, I mean, certainly these cases have arisen, and I mean, there is a bakery case in Northern Ireland, isn't there?
Yeah.
Looking at Edward here.
Different, but
it can get down to individual people and these kinds of issues. I suppose I still want to say that, because this is the subject and the topic of this seminar, I still want to say that freedom of speech is absolutely fundamental to whatever process we go through in trying to resolve these issues. We must hear both sides. We must hear the reason why. We must understand both the reason why the bakers don't want to bake the cake and the reason why the couple want the cake baked. So we cannot suppress the discussion. That's my view to you. If we suppress the discussion and only allowed one side to be heard and one side to be amplified in the media, we are doing a disservice to our society and we're bringing about danger. So by all means, let there be debate. And if one side wins, one side wins. Of course, people who have faith, people who are religious, will believe that their case ultimately will win, because they believe it is not only a rational case, but they believe that it actually comports with the whole nature of the universe. So they will believe that ultimately the lion will lie down with the lamb, to quote the book of the prophet Isaiah.
Well, but there are many religious people among those who assert equality for same-sex marriage.
yes.
They may have a different religion or a different sect or different tendency, but there are many religious people who support, I mean, also gender equality. I mean, that was.
I remember writing.
The leaders in the United States to legalize abortion were people of faith. I mean, the clergy consultation service run out of, I think, principally out of New York, with Reverend Moody leading, was incredibly instrumental in securing the legalization of abortion and people's access even before it was legal.
That's fine, but that's not really the relevant issue, is it? I mean, the relevant issue is people who do believe that because of their faith, that this is something that's not just, that's wrong, that's, absolutely wrong. And you talked about the mother of one of those people in the Masterpiece Cake Shop. I went to a presentation, and I mean, not close to this at all, but I talked about how upset the baker was that he was being forced to do something that was deeply against his principles. And this was somehow a legal responsibility for him to do something that was not a matter of, in his view, discrimination, just a matter of a very strongly held principle that he was supporting sin. So it's sure, there are lots of people who are don't see a conflict between religion and the rights that you're arguing for, but there are people who do. And
I didn't say there wasn't a conflict. What I was saying is that there are people on both sides of the conflict of faith.
Sure.
And for the people, there is no question in my mind about Jack Phillips' personal conflict and struggle with this. There's no question in my mind about the faith consequences for him. I was only pointing out, agreeing with Sandy, that there are people on both sides. And
Sure.
for Reverend Moody, that was a principle of faith, to be acting to save the lives of women and to be ensuring that they would be there for their families. And it's an act of faith for other people who opposed, for example, the legalization.
Right. So there are winners and there are losers. And so the baker is the loser and the gay couple is the winner, or else vice versa in this case, or at least, as you say, in suspense. But I mean, you're coming to a conflict, and whether it's a free speech issue, I'm not sure, because this is a discrimination law.
I think
that's an issue. Sorry, Cindy.
No, that's quite all right. I think before we leave this and go in about 10 minutes to Mike and the questions, I there is a very dramatic case on the international scene at the moment that Mike alluded to earlier, Mike Scott, in Afghanistan, where the prevailing party force of the Taliban has no real interest in free speech. There's no conflict between these issues for them. They see themselves as having an opportunity once again to create and is a caliphate, a religious, a theocracy. There are a number of words we have available for it. And I think this is a unique situation presented to us right now in international affairs, in politics, domestic politics in this country, for the obvious reason that President Biden made this decision that he made. And I wonder how, I mean, here is really a winners and losers issue. And I think particularly of the prospects for women in Afghanistan under these circumstances. And I don't know who, I think of you as representing the sweep of history here, Edward. But I don't know who, and maybe Kelsey wants to take this up as the person who's dealing with political issues day to day and how to describe them.
Well, I did have a comment related to this, and it actually touches on what Edward and Louise were just speaking about sort of the wide range of religious voices operating in the public square. So you think about what's happening in Afghanistan, you think about the tragedies that we've already seen and anticipate for the future. And I think that where I stood was, although it's an extreme example, the Taliban, this is what some folks fear about religion more generally, that it's about control, it's about hurting women, that it's an aggressive force for ill. And I think that in this moment, faith groups of all stripes have an opportunity to rise up and say, no, in this moment, religion drives us to be helpers, to reach out and save people who are in danger, and to speak up and sort of help build a better world. And so what I've been listening for and watching for in my inbox, like press releases, for example, is how many faith groups around the world are mobilizing to be part of the humanitarian solution. And that helps change the narrative around religion more generally, and helps people who aren't part of a faith group just have a more positive connection point with faith as a force for good in society. And so it's a test for these religious actors of sort of who they will be in this moment. Will they be sending press releases attacking politicians, or will they be sending press releases saying, here's all of our activities that we're undertaking to help save lives?
Edward, your thoughts on the
Taliban
issue?
Well, I think one thing to look for, and we're going to have to see, is the average age in Afghanistan is 20, and the new generation of Taliban is very mobile phone friendly. They've lived for 20 years. I mean, Afghanistan's a very complicated country, but parts of them have lived with a great deal more women's education, and that tends to be a social force that has its own momentum. So it may turn out that despite the stereotyping, you saw this in Iran, where women's education has continued quite a bit, despite the so-called fundamentalism of the government there, that we'll see somewhat different outcomes than we might want. And one can call that secularism. I think that's a fair thing. That even in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, people are aware of new thinking in global ways. And it may be a while before Louise is going to get gay rights into Afghanistan. But the idea of women's education is one that has a lot of appeal in a lot of parts of the world, and it takes a good deal of Islamic to see that as an Islamic teaching that women shouldn't be educated, when almost all throughout the countries with predominant Muslim populations and with avowedly Muslim governments, women's education is very highly, well, at least somewhat valued. So I think we might we might not see this actually as a religious issue in due course. That said, it's obviously they're not going to be rushing for mini skirts and so forth. So you know, the women that are very prominent in Afghanistan, quite rightly, I think, are very afraid that their position isn't going to be there. But I'm not sure that looking at that as a religious conflict is really very helpful in Afghanistan in that way. But I would certainly agree with Kelsey, is that it's a sort of easy win for religious groups here in the West to say, you know, we're in favor of letting in Afghans who are persecuted by their government. I mean, that's always an easy win in a way to say that.
I think easy win is perhaps a slightly cynical way of putting it. I mean, the people who are genuinely upset, you know, have lost sleep at night because they are really concerned and want to help. So I wouldn't. An easy win seems to me to be a slightly not the way I would want to describe it. I mean, for me, the issue, because it's a geopolitical issue. You know, we understand that previously the Taliban gave sanctuary to terrorist groups which attacked the West. And the question is whether or not they will do the same again. And I mean, according to, you know, Bush and Blair, the reason for going in was to extirpate Al-Qaeda or Daesh, to make the streets safer in New York. So that was the reason for going in. So the question is whether or not the new Taliban will be, you know, brothers in arms with resurgent terrorist groups, and whether China, which has a huge initiative across the world and is after the lithium deposits in Afghanistan, will seize these things. And as a result, what we will end up with is the kind of political model which is in China, a single party state, and the democracies of the West, which are engaged in their own internal quarrels, will not stand up to a much more difficult political system. And if I can just conclude, I mean, this is what happened in Europe in the 1930s. We had Hitler, we had Stalin, we had Mussolini, we had Franco, we had dictators in Europe, we had freedom, which was suppressed. And when the war was won, it was in 1948 that we got the Great Declaration of Human Rights, which was a declaration about freedom of religion, freedom of expression, following on the victory of the democracies over the dictatorships of Europe. And I just hope that the democracies will manage to pull themselves together in order to resist the juggernaut that is China.
William, thank you. That was a very interesting way to summarize the problem we face. And I think if we can pull it out of politics a little bit in the West and talk about it on the basis of larger principles, that might be helpful. I'm going to turn things over to Michael Scott in Oxford now, who has been looking at, I'm sure, a fair number of questions, and ask him to curate them and take over the next part of the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. I've been listening to this fascinating discussion as we've gone on, and some very interesting questions have come in. First of all, Paula Toledo, who's been listening to us from Brazil, she says, the paradox of tolerance states that if a society is tolerant without limit, its ability to be tolerant is eventually seized or destroyed by the intolerant. Should societies tolerate intolerant speech if it is in the name of people's faith?
Great
Who'd
question.
like to take that one? You look
I want
eager
Louise
to
to take
take
that
it
one.
there, William.
Well, I don't know about eager, but I mean, hard cases make bad law. I mean, it is, of course, it is a very difficult question. And if there is intolerance that eventually subverts the entire principle of toleration, then we are going to be put into a position where we may have to move in another direction. But I mean, in general, for most situations, for most people, in normal life, then tolerance is the principle. If there is intolerance, and most, you know, there's slander, there's libel, there's invective, there's racial hatred, incitement. These things are often kind of the limits of tolerance, and people understand those, and they're totally terrorism, incitement to terrorism. So people do see there are certain things that are off limits, even for tolerance. So most people will say there's a big, you know, 90% area where there's tolerance, and there's a whole 10% contested area where, okay, there may be, we may not have that principle that is uppermost.
So coming here as a representative of the ACLU, I will say that we advocate that the Constitution tolerates a lot of speech, including some really ugly speech, but I want to flag a couple of things about that. So first of all, context really matters. So in a workplace, for example, you can't engage in certain kinds of harassment that are words that create hostile work environments. Like, we recognize that the workplace is a particular kind of space. There are certain kinds of, you know, we are advocating on behalf of transgender students to be recognized by their appropriate gender identity. For example, when they're in school, you can't have a true threat to threaten somebody so as to limit their speech. And then second, what I think is really critical of what we try to do, and what I think goes back to things William has been saying, is in the context where we represent people who are engaged in hateful speech, that it's incredibly important at the same time to be elevating what the consequences are of that speech for other people, so as to ensure both that the people who are the subject of speech are heard and seen, and that we have a more robust debate about what it means to be tolerant and the price of that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. From Alika Doyle, she says, part of the discussion referenced Cambridge University's need to differentiate tolerance and respect of other belief structures and expression. Can something be truly tolerated without being respected? Is respect for a belief tantamount to agreement? Edward, you want to have a go on that?
Sure. I think, well, I'm not a big fan of tolerance as a very helpful concept. So I think tolerance is a kind of position that we take where we're uncomfortable with something, but we don't have the courage or the political capacity or the power to ban it. If we really mean tolerate, we mean exactly that. We mean, we're not crazy about the fact that you can do this, but we, for whatever reason, because we believe in free speech or something or other, we think we have to put up with it. So yeah, that's what tolerance means. If we say, I respect your views, well, what does it, you know, at some point you have to try and figure out what that means. Do you respect my belief, say, that there's something unnatural about same-sex relations? Well, you clearly don't respect it very much if you say that if I say that, I'm engaging in hate speech. So I don't feel very tolerated at that point. I mean, hypothetically here. So I'm not quite sure where we're going to draw a line between respect and I understand what tolerance means. It means I tolerate that you can say this. I'm not quite sure whether you can get that to stretch out to mean that we're going to respect people who have views we really strongly disagree with. We might be able to, but not always.
Elsie, would you agree with that? Or
I was landing more with what William was describing, where there's this really tricky area of conflict, which is where a lot of my work is focused, where probably a lot of all of our work is focused. But at the end of the day, there's plenty of less complicated issues that we have to work on and put a lot of energy behind, where we just have basic disagreements and really ugly actions that could be addressed. And so that probably sounds like I'm sidestepping the real issue, but mostly it's just that I think we can all stand to have a little more tolerance in our lives, and that'll maybe help us towards solving those more difficult issues.
Just
Well,
to
a
say,
specific-
you
Sorry.
can look up, you can look up online and you will see the debate that took place at Cambridge and what the implications of respect were as against the implications of tolerance. So that's why the academics at Cambridge didn't want the word respect. They had reason for it. So you can look that up. It's quite well developed and easy to understand.
Thanks for that, William. It goes on to a specific, and I think this is related more to American University. It comes from Erin Green. Curious as to the panelists' thoughts on freedom of religion and speech for religious universities across the United States, who actively discriminate against queer and trans students on a daily basis, above and beyond their straight peers. Is it right that they receive tax exemption status as well as federal funding? This seems to be an big American issue. Louise, do you want to have a go at this one?
There's a very big lawsuit right now that has been filed against a host of religious universities, arguing that the ongoing discrimination is a violation of the Constitution. And the debate is over a provision of federal law, Title IX, which provides an exemption for schools that I think, Kelsey, you may remember even better than I, that are like under the control, religiously controlled. And then you can have an exemption if you say that your beliefs conflict with one particular rule of barring sex discrimination. And this suit is challenging that on the grounds that the Establishment Clause doesn't give you the right to hurt other people. So that case is newly filed. I think we have a very, very informed questioner, because the questioner is referencing, without saying it, a case called Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University is a school, but at a particular time in its history, it barred admission and retention of students who advocated or engaged in interracial dating. And the IRS withdrew its tax exempt status, saying that it didn't count as a charitable organization if it had these particular views. Case goes to the United States Supreme Court. Bob Jones University argues this is a violation of its right to religion, and the court dismisses it like very quickly, and says, these are your beliefs, but there's a compelling state interest in ending discrimination that overrides your interest. We have a very different court right now than we had at the time that Bob Jones University was decided. So we'll see where this case goes. But I think if there's one thing that I can say with tremendous confidence about the United States Supreme Court, it is that the law around religion is in a process of radical revision, not just with this immediate court, but even before. We're seeing a real transformation. So we'll see where that case goes. But it is taxpayer dollars being used.
There were a couple of comments I wanted to
religion.
make. I'm glad that Louise offered that history on Bob Jones University, because I recently wrote about the Supreme Court's past approach to racial discrimination and current approach to religious freedom, LGBTQ rights. And really what's interesting is that they, in the past, came down very hard and decisively about, religious freedom claim does not win in this case. The compelling interest of the government in rooting out racism does. And then in Master v. Kaesop, and then in this last summer with an issue over adoption agencies and their treatment of same-sex couples, the Supreme Court was really in this gray area. We're not going to answer yet. It's not settled. And so that is a difference, that there's sort of like been opportunities for the court to say decisively how we're going to move forward, and they haven't. The other thing I wanted to mention is that it does weigh heavily on me when I cover these issues that it's so difficult to talk about these issues, because to those students and to their supporters and to many folks in the US, that is discrimination, that is almost cruelty in a sense that the universities are up to. But to many religious leaders, to people of faith across the country, it's not fair to call that discrimination, because it's them sort of living out their faith, and they think that they're doing sort of what God has asked them to do. And so at the end of the day, we end up with who gets to define discrimination. And that's what makes this so hard, and why I keep returning to it, because it's like, how do we move forward when people are operating with different understandings of the situation in front of them? And so we maybe need help from the Supreme Court at the end of the day for them to say, okay, we've heard both sides, this is how we're going to move forward.
I just want to point out one other case that Kelsey alluded to, which is the United States Supreme Court in a case in which a Piggy Park, a barbecue franchise, refused to serve people who were Black. The owner said that was a violation of his faith. And there were faith claims in support of continued segregation had been accepted by the courts for decades. But the Supreme Court said no, and they rejected it in just literally a couple of sentences. So I want to reiterate Kelsey's point that it's a very different conversation right now. And the $6 million question is, and why are these two things different?
And one other note from that, the way the question was worded was about sort of hyper focusing the school leaders on LGBTQ students, and just sort of making them feel attacked or picked on. And I think that's something I've heard from religious college professors that I've interviewed, people who are invested in sort of building a healthier, safer campus, is how do we allow these schools to live out their beliefs about gender or sexuality or marriage, but ensure that they're applying those beliefs in a way that sort of touches all students and isn't so hyper-focused on the LGBT community. I'm not sure I'm making sense, but basically it's that, are you worried about the dating lives of all your students? Are you worried about nurturing strong relationships or strong ideas about love and marriage among all your students? Or are you really spending all your energy on just this smaller group of LGBTQ students? And so that's really where a lot of professors are landing, is how do we just have better conversations about this that don't make the gay or transgender students stick out like sore thumbs all the time?
Well, very interesting answers there. Can I go to a question that came in from S. Judy? And it's really to Professor Kay, because she the questioner says, what is the alternative to dealing with the existential issues Professor Kay refers to? What are the alternatives?
Oh, well, you can go through literature and find them. You can start with Ionesco and the Theatre of the Absurd. Life has no meaning. Life is a joke, a cruel joke. You can read Bertrand Russell's The Free Man's Worship, and the whole universe will burn down, the sun will grow cold, the human race will become extinct. There is no purpose. You can read your French existentialists, you can read Albert Camus and The Myth of Sisyphus, and we roll the stone up the hill and roll it down again. So that's one reason why I became a Christian. I read French existentialism as a young man. I found it provoking to suicide, and I came to a faith in Christ because the answers offered by the fashionable existentialists, the Camus and the Sartre, were simply unsatisfactory for me. And so for my own experience is one of going through the literature of the 20th century and coming out surprisingly with a faith in Christ as providing meaning and purpose and hope. So I hope that answers your question.
Interesting reply there, William. Of course, they're pretty good plays, some of Ionesco's plays, you know, and I'm pretty glad that they were written, and Beckett and Adamov and the rest of them, because I studied them for finals, I remember, and enjoyed them, even though I was a Christian. But anyway. Let's go on from that, because another question came in. Can scientists offer something that religious leaders can't offer. For example, religion has a view of what happens after death, which some scientists would actually want to qualify or disagree with.
Can I jump in on this at the expense of being, unless someone else is itching to say something? Because it is important, I think, to say that many of the early scientists were believers. You know, you look at Isaac Newton, who is a theist. You look at Robert Boyle, who wrote his law about gas. You look at Tycho Brahe. You look at Copernicus. These people looked at the universe and they saw a rational universe made by a rational God. And they expected to find causation because they believed that the rational God was behind the universe. So I want to say that science and religion are not enemies. In fact, one and the other, they complement each other. Sorry, that's my little two pennyworth on that subject.
I will add that just last week I stumbled upon a column from Ross Douthat at the New York Times, and he was writing about sort of the reasons to be brought to faith, or sort of a roadmap for someone looking to embrace faith. And it was a lot of what William was just describing, that it's sort of like we are used to thinking of, do you accept science or do you accept faith? And he was just trying to explain that in his mind, there is no gap between those things. There's not even really a tension between those things. And so it was a recent column from him that I believe came out last week that may be really helpful to read.
If I can make another recommendation of a very large book, because I'm going to lead a discussion group on this next term. It's Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. It's right in front of me because I'm reading it. But he has a very long discussion about the supposed conflict of science and faith and why it started and what it means and so forth. And the thinking about why people decided at some point that science was very opposed to faith. And it's probably has more to do with Darwin than with anything else. And evolution was certainly used as a sort of anti-faith thing, but it's an interesting question. It's a fascinating piece of history, and you know, I'm agreeing with both of you too that well, maybe not with what you're saying, Cassie, but what Ross Douthat says is that there isn't an intrinsic opposition between science and religion, but it's one that people have seen on both sides, actually, more on the side.
One small silver lining of the terrible, difficult COVID-19 pandemic is that a lot of people of faith in the world of science have come forward to say, let's talk about vaccines, let's talk about this illness, let me help walk you through this from a religious perspective. And so there's been a lot of really great conversations from people who are very deeply faithful, but very, very committed to their scientific careers. And so it's been exciting to see that conversation happening.
We're coming. I'm going to ask everyone to answer this question, which has come in, which is a corollary from one of the earlier ones. But the question is quite simple. It says, "But do we still need religion in modern society?" So, who wants to start? Do we really need religion? And you haven't got very long, so quick-fired answers. Do we really need religion in modern society?
Are you asking for yes or no answers?
I can see
Mike?
thought bubbles going up at the moment, and Sandy coming in.
No, I just said you're not asking for yes and no answers.
No, I'm not
I know
asking for
we're
yes or
10 and 10.
no. No, I'm not answering yes or no. I'm answering the question. Yeah. Who wants to take it first? Come on, who's brave enough to take this one?
I don't think we need religion in modern society. I think we need religion as humans. We need some connection. Our lives, that's just how we are. That's a belief that our natural self yearns for the supernatural, and that religion is a way that we live in communities in connection with that supernatural. But that's, of course, not something that everyone is going to agree with.
Louise, what's your...
I'm not going to comment on whether we need religion in society, as opposed to that, at least I'm just here with the US perspective, that the Constitution protects freedom of religion. We need to protect freedom of religion and diverse religions. And we also need to respect with freedom of religion as with other constitutional rights, what their limits are, and to really work to make sure that freedom of religion, like other rights, isn't used to hurt other people.
Of course, there's freedom of speech is within the Constitution, isn't it?
Yes.
As well.
Yeah. But you asked about religion.
Yes, I know, but I just remember what the title of the discussion is: conflict and religion. There might be a conflict there, but I won't go into that.
That's why I said we have to make sure we don't.
In a sense, you've been talking about that. Kelsey, what's your answer to this? Do we still need religion in society?
What I often return to when I reflect on a question like this, and I've written about it before, is that what's sometimes lost in all of these really juicy debates about how to solve conflicts between religious freedom and gay rights, or religious freedom and speech, or just how to build policies that bring us forward into a new era, is that religion continues to be one of the most effective ways to call out people's better angels, to sort of bring them to a place where they are other-minded, they help each other. And so I've written about it in the sense of like our social safety net. The government certainly plays a huge role in that here in the US, but the government is often operating through faith groups, sending government resources and then allowing faith groups to push them out on the ground. And so that's really where I land, is that I still think religion plays an essential role in helping us be our best selves.
Thank you very much. William.
Yes, I mean, I absolutely. I think that if we are free, then there will be religion, because I think religion is part of what we are as human beings. But I think if you removed religion, I think a vast amount of charitable and humanitarian work would disappear. If by some thought experiment you simply took religion out, you would find there would be Salvation Army hostels that were closed. There would be drug rehabilitation centers that were closed. There would be vast numbers of orphanages. All kinds of things would disappear if you simply removed religion from the scene. And I think that the humanitarian aspect of religion is vital. Of course, I believe that there's more than a humanitarian aspect, because I believe there is a God. But having said that, I think that religion is vital to society, and I think, yes, we need it.
Well, thank you. Sandy, before I close this, is there anything you want to say?
Well, I do want to thank everybody for participating. We've had in these, I guess you said it was 10 months now that we've been doing these, Mike, and we've had an extraordinary cross-section of people representing a wide range of views, and we've continued to do that today. So thank you to all of you for participating in this ongoing effort at International Dialogues. We're grateful to, I'm very grateful to my colleague, Mike Scott, and what we've been doing, to those who support us at Georgetown University and also at Blackfriars Hall in making this possible.
Well, thank you, Sandy. My thanks to Kelsey Dallas, Edward Hadas, William Kay, and Louise Melling. I found it a really fascinating discussion, and one that, you know, I feel that we could have done another program on it. I have to say, Sandy and I had a few problems with this program in terms that we did have somebody from the Muslim faith who was going to be speaking as well, but who unfortunately for personal reasons and his diary had to withdraw. But there might be other times that we can get back to these questions with various people. But I think you've actually raised a lot of very, very interesting issues today. My thanks to colleagues at Georgetown, to the President, Jack DeGioia, to the Vice President Global Affairs, Tom Banshoff, and at Blackfriars, to John O'Connor, the Regent, and to Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute. I'd like to thank Margaret Scott for being our UK Administrator. At Campion Hall, my thanks to Dr. Nick Austin, Master of Campion Hall, and Sarah Gray and Ying Ying, our Campion Hall administrators. Thanks also to Christopher Davis and Jaime Moore Carrillo and colleagues at Georgetown who made this Zoom event happen. And thanks to all of you who've asked questions today. If they weren't answered today, because of time constraints, we will endeavour to email answers to you, but I think we did get through the majority of questions today. The next free speech project at Crossroads, the International Dialogues event, will be in association with the Future Humanities Project, will be on Monday, the 20th of September at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. BST, when we will be discussing issues relating to free speech and those whose voices are taken away from them by human traffickers and traders. We have some very, very interesting speakers for that very, very important dialogue. So that's the 20th of September at 11 a.m. US time, 4 p.m. BST. So thank you all for attending. Please join us for that event, 20th of September. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until the next time, take care, keep safe, goodbye. Thanks again to the panel. Goodbye, everybody.